So last semester I took a class on the 18th century Gothic novel and I became slightly obsessed. Today we're gonna talk about the Gothic because that's kind of all I want to talk about now. The reason I decided to make this video is because I've been kind of looking for video essays on YouTube about the specific topic I'm gonna be covering regarding the Gothic novel, and I couldn't find any further information on YouTube about it, and I just realized that I really need, I need to be the voice. Today, basically what I'm gonna try to do is come to a conclusion about why there's so much incest in the Gothic novel. In the 18th century Gothic novel, there's a lot of incest. It's to the point where it's one of the tropes of the Gothic novel, the original 18th century Gothic novel. And I want to know why. Because typically when you're studying English, what I noticed is that if something is repeated enough times, it's usually repeated for a good reason, and it's usually there to suggest something or to show something. So I want to know why there's so much incest in the Gothic novel, and especially between the heroine of the story, the female heroine, and the villain. It usually turns out in some sort of event, like a plot twist at the end, or it's known all along that he is her brother, her uncle, her father figure. And sometimes the incest is a little bit more subdued, and sometimes it is very in your face, like with the monk, which we're going to talk about. The reason I sort of became obsessed with the Gothic and the reason I decided to take the class in the first place is because we're kind of living through the Gothic resurgence. I think you might have seen videos about that already on YouTube. There are video essays about why we're living in the Gothic resurgence already. It's just not going to be this because I want to talk about incest. So a lot of the material that I pulled for this video is kind of from my class that I took, from the conversations with my prof, or just the class material, so some of it cannot be cited. However, the research that I've done for this video will be cited in the description. Also, I just wanted to mention I will be talking about sexual assault. Obviously, I'm going to be talking about incest, and I will be spoiling the books that I'm going to be talking about. Okay. I just wanted to quickly introduce the books I'm going to be talking about as well. I will be mainly talking about 3 18th century Gothic novels in this video. Out of the 5 books we've covered in class, 3 of them have incest in it. These are the 3 I'm going to be talking about. So I have 2 of them in front of me here, and then the other one I don't, because I read it through audio. It's actually a free audiobook on YouTube if you are interested. The first one I'm going to be talking about is called The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole. It's actually considered the first Gothic novel. And then My Little Baby, The Romance of the Forest by Anne Radcliffe, the Queen herself. And then The Problem Child, The Monk by Matthew Lewis. He was only 19 when he wrote this. Kind of a genius, but also kind of crazy. But anyways, let me have some tea. Or wait, actually, I have coffee. Good. I'm not gonna delve too deep about the history of the novel, Gothic novel, because I just don't really want to. Because I'm not really interested in how the novel, the actual genre of a novel came about. The Gothic novel is a genre that has been looked down upon historically. It was sort of created by women mostly, and it was also read by women predominantly. So the fear with the public and the censors and everything was that the women, the women with their tiny brains are going to be influenced by this Gothic, scary, depraved content, and they were really scared of that. They were censoring these books, like especially with the monk. This invited a lot of conversation because it was so controversial, but I have the impression that overall, like as a whole, the Gothic novel was deeply, deeply misunderstood. There was a tendency for authors that are interested in expressing some sort of political belief to put that belief into a Gothic novel instead of a treatise or some sort of like political text, because they could very easily face jail time for that. Just knowing the brief political context behind the Gothic is important, obviously with the French Revolution, and the fact that England was heavily censoring any sort of pro-French Revolution thought, like what they perceived to be pro-French Revolution thought, or like critique of the monarchy, critique of like the English way of life, or the English sort of like status quo. Also, it's important to know the gender dynamics at that time. So feminine men were severely looked down upon. Obviously, gay men were looked down upon. Two of the authors that I'm going to be talking about, Matthew Lewis and Horace Walpole, the first Gothic novel writer, they were both gay. So it's important to note the like toxic masculinity aspect of society that was kind of pushed on men. The feminine men used to be called macaroni as well, so that was a derogatory term for a feminine man. Because of the war with the French and the French Revolution and everything, feminine men were considered a weakness, and especially in a wartime, the sort of like strong, oppressive, like dominant man was sort of considered to be the better alternative to that, which resulted in men that didn't fit that mold to feel and become ostracized. The Gothic genre features things like the terror mode and the horror mode. It tends to operate in either of those. I will expand a little bit on that later, but basically just to introduce them. The terror mode deals with the Radcliffean side of things, so Anne Radcliffe, who wrote the Romance of the Forest, which, by the way, if you're a Jane Austen fan, you would probably know who Anne Radcliffe is already. The Romance of the Forest is actually mentioned in Emma. It is the book that Harriet gives to Robert Martin, and he doesn't read it, and Emma uses that as an excuse to basically tell her not to marry him. And then The Northanger Abbey, another Jane Austen book, is basically a parody of The Mysteries of Udolpho, another Anne Radcliffe's book. You might be familiar already with Anne Radcliffe. She operates with the terror mode. Essentially what that means is that she writes about terrible things happening, like the possibility of a terrible thing happening, but she doesn't show it on the page. She kind of just lets you feel the terror, and she lets you sort of feel this like, please God, like I hope this doesn't happen to her, you know? And then it doesn't. So she dissipates your fear at the end. It's kind of like cathartic in a way. You could argue that it's not cathartic, but Matthew Lewis would probably argue that it's not cathartic. And Matthew Lewis is the example of somebody operating in a horror mode. The horror mode typically operates from the standpoint of showing the terrible things. So let's say in Anne Radcliffe, there is a threat of rape. There is a threat of incest. In The Monk by Matthew Lewis, there's a threat of rape and incense. There is a threat of rape and incest, and then there is the showing of rape and incest on the page. So there isn't just this feeling of like, oh my God, I hope this doesn't happen. There is a feeling of dread and inescapability and like hopelessness as well that comes with it. There's also a bunch of tropes in the Gothic literature, so keep in mind also that the Gothic changes as every genre does, but because the Gothic is so it's not like, you know, a rom-com. There's a million different ways to write a rom-com. The Gothic is very much like, it has to have specific elements in it, like in the story and in the setting. to make it a Gothic novel. The tropes obviously change throughout like the years. We kind of tend to see a lot of that change happening towards the Victorian era as well. With, for example, Jane Eyre. It is a Gothic novel, but it is not the same as the 18th century Gothic novel. Like, it has the vibe and it is a Gothic novel, but it kind of changes things a little bit. I might make a video about Jane Eyre because I absolutely love Jane Eyre. But anyways, today we're not going to be talking about Jane Eyre, unfortunately. I absolutely love Jane Eyre. Probably my favorite book. Some of the tropes that we see in the 18th century Gothic novel are like the abbeys, the ancestral home that usually symbolizes patriarchal power. So like the abbeys, the castles, the dungeons. Notably, the female protagonist usually gets trapped in one of those during the plot. Then we have the unspeakable or the unspoken, where someone can literally not talk, or it's something so terrible that nobody talks about it, like the incest. The supernatural aspect of it, so every Gothic novel has a conversation with the supernatural. If you're an Anne Radcliffe subscriber, to the Radcliffean Gothic, then you know that Anne Radcliffe sort of dissipates the supernatural. She explains it away. It's all very much rational, whereas someone like Matthew Lewis, the supernatural is there. It is magical. It's not explained. Let's talk about the Castle of Otranto. It is considered to be the first Gothic novel. It also supposedly came to Horace Walpole in a dream, which is another very, very Gothic motif for dreams and for things to show up in dreams, which is also why I would argue that Twilight is very, very Gothic, because Stephenie Meyer also had Twilight show up to her in a dream. Just very Gothic of Stephenie. We love that for you, Stephenie. The novel's main themes are toxic masculinity, domestic violence, what happens when a man who you and in your society around you thinks is the way that a man should be, what happens when he is in charge of the family and of the estate, what happens to people around him, oppression, like expectations as well, expectations placed on men, and the way feminine men are treated in society. Essentially, the novel follows a man called Manfred who is desperately trying to secure his lineage and to secure the castle of Otranto within his lineage. The novel starts with his son Conrad being crushed by a giant helmet. Yes. Yes, I don't know. I don't know why. There's also an element of the absurd in this novel for sure, but yeah, so Conrad gets crushed by a giant helmet on his wedding day, and that leaves Manfred without a son, which means that the castle of Otranto, we kind of don't know where it's going to go now, right? The family has lost its heir, so he needs to secure another heir. He has a daughter, but the castle follows the male line. So, and they don't have, I guess, they don't have a Mr. Collins. He needs to secure another heir, and he needs to do it now if he wants to keep the castle with the family. So his genius plan is to marry his daughter-in-law to be. He basically is trying to marry his son's fiance, right? Because it was supposedly their wedding day and it didn't go through because, his son died. So now he's going to marry his son's fiance. Her name is Isabella. So Isabella is now trying to run away. She runs away into a church. She escapes him. She ends up coming back, and then there's a bunch of stuff that goes down. The portraits start walking out of their frames and trying to stop Manfred from committing this act of basically incest. Everyone's very much aware of how messed up the situation is and how messed up Manfred is, because they realize that he is trying to marry somebody who would have been his daughter figure. And she is his daughter figure, even even in this situation, despite the fact that the marriage never actually took place, there is a feeling that this is all messed up. This should not be taking place. We get this imagery of supernatural, like ghosts. There's a giant knight, this ancestral vibe of like, what are you doing, Manfred? This is wrong. Please stop trying to get married to your daughter-in-law. And then the castle ends up destroyed by this giant knight whose helmet crushed Conrad. We don't get much of an explanation for the knight, I think. Yeah, so that's how it ends. No incest actually takes place. So this is one of the novels where the incest is sort of threatened, but it doesn't actually occur. Isabella runs away. She ends up escaping him the entire time. One interesting thing about this novel is Conrad, the character of the son that actually dies in the very, very beginning. We never hear him speak. He doesn't have any lines. He doesn't have a voice. He is just described by pretty much everybody as like this weak, blah sort of man, a non-person basically. And what I find really interesting about this is that Horace Walpole is what was actually, as a gay man, described in a similar way as well by his peers, that he was, because he was feminine, he was a weakling, he wasn't really a man. He was this macaroni figure. Conrad is also kind of like a macaroni. He symbolizes what happens to a man who does not fit the societal mold, who may or may not be gay. He literally gets crushed by a helmet. The helmet is the social expectations, guys, okay? We also see someone like Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who is, I love Samuel Taylor Coleridge, but he said some really interesting things. Horace Walpole has another novel called The Mysterious Mother. I have not read it, but what he said about The Mysterious Mother, there's also incest in that as well, fun fact. But basically what he said is, quote, "Most disgusting, vile, detestable composition that ever came from the hand of man. No one with a spark of true manliness, of which Horace Walpole had none, could have written." We see exactly what Horace Walpole was writing about reflected in the society's attitudes. This is the first depiction of incest in the novels I'm gonna be talking about. So despite the fact that they never marry, Manfred wanting to marry his daughter-in-law and wanting her, to continue his line, like have his heirs, is quite despicable. She is not exactly in a position of power here, and for her to have her consent undermined like that by her father-in-law, who was supposed to protect her, is disturbing and depraved, and it is very much disturbing and depraved in the novel itself as well. It's not just like us being the modern reader and reading, and thinking about modern sensibilities. Like, no, this was very much disgusting in the novel as well. Let's talk about the romance of the forest. My little precious. I love her. She's a little bit boring, but she is just the best. Like, I love this book. The incest here is a little bit more explicit. Nothing actually occurs. Like, there's the threat of rape and incest, like I said, because Anne Radcliffe operates with the terror mode, nothing actually occurs, just the threat of it. The Romance of the Forest follows Adeline, who is this orphaned girl. She grows up in a convent, and she gets taken to this abbey, and in the following events, it turns out that the abbey is owned by this marquis, and the marquis is a crazed lunatic. The minute he sees Adeline, he wants to sleep with her, and of course, lo and behold, it turns out that he's her uncle. I feel like Damon and Rhaenyra really just desensitized us to the uncle and niece incest. We don't have to talk about that. She ends up escaping the marquee at the end. She is, happily living with her husband and everything at the end. Like she has a good ending. But the fact that she is pursued by this marquis who's her uncle, it leaves this thread of dread. The entire novel, you feel this like deep in your stomach. Romance of the Forest is actually a comment as well on the American Revolution. In the book, Adeline says that her entire purpose in life is to pursue life and liberty. This is a callback to the Declaration of Independence, so life, liberty, and happiness, I believe it is. Anne Radcliffe didn't put the happiness bit in there because it would have been too obvious. I mean, it was pretty obvious already, but she was afraid of censorship, and so she omitted the happiness part. Basically, Adeline is this figure of revolution. She puts herself first. She pursues life, liberty, and happiness. Her own life, liberty, and happiness. So here we have again the mode of terror. As Anne Radcliffe put it herself, the mode of terror expands your soul. It makes you afraid, but it makes you act. It makes you want to escape. It makes you want to root for the character to escape. It makes you awestruck, and it makes you scared, but it makes you not hopeless. It makes you not feel stuck. The mode of horror, on the other hand, she criticized it because she believed that it made you feel stuck and hopeless because of the inevitability of what's going to happen. You feel this sense of dread, but the dread doesn't go away. The dread only gets worse until it carries out, until the deed is carried out, It's kind of like watching a true crime podcast. I sort of have this feeling I know something bad is going to happen because I'm watching a true crime podcast. Like, let's say it's about like a killing of somebody. It's like happening, and this happens, and then this happens, and then the dread gets worse and worse and worse, and then it happens. And then instead of feeling this like expansive feeling of relief when it's over, it's just this dreadful acceptance of what happened, right? So this is what Anne Radcliffe tries to avoid. Her books are mainly an example of the female Gothic, which we'll touch on that later. The female Gothic and the eco Gothic. Hello, I'm back. It's been a couple of days. That's why I might look a little bit different, or like the lighting might look a little bit different. I put on the same shirt, so hopefully that can like help the continuity a little bit. But basically, I think where I left off was just talking about the female Gothic and the eco Gothic that Anne Radcliffe's books are usually read through the lens of. These two theories apply to the Romance of the Forest as well, but they kind of deserve its own video almost, because there's just so much to discuss when it comes to the female Gothic and the eco Gothic. And now we're going to talk about the monk. The car crash you can't look away from, the horror mode of writing, the pioneer of it. Let's talk about the monk. So it's very intense. I mean, look at this cover. Look at this cover. It's quite scary. Like, just based on the cover, I think you can kind of get the vibe of what the book is going to be like. The book follows the monk. Shocker, whose name is Ambrosio, and we follow him through his sort of fall from grace. We follow him from his seduction to a descent into sin, essentially. Ambrosio ends up being seduced by this like demon person called Matilda, who initially appears to him as one of the monks in the abbey that he lives in. Then we find out that Matilda is actually a woman. Matilda seduces Ambrosio. They sleep together, premarital sex, blah blah blah. Ambrosio freaks out. This is like his gateway drug into sin, and then he goes more and more and more off the rails after that. And then he becomes obsessed with this woman, or girl I should say, named Antonia. He ends up kidnapping her and raping her at the end. And then at the very, very end, it is revealed by Satan that Antonia is actually Ambrosio's sister.
Oh my god.
There are a lot of things we can discuss about the monk. I could probably make a whole video about the monk just on its own because there's so much. In the end, Ambrosio meets a very tragic end, as he deserves, because he's quite literally the worst. He is thrown off a cliff by the devil himself, and he's eaten by a bunch of bugs, and then he, drowns. So yeah. Now that I've introduced all of the books and how incest actually shows up in these books, it's time to discuss why there's so much incest in these books. And I think when it comes to Gothic novels, it is important to ask yourself two questions. The first question is, what is the fear? What are we scared of here? And the second question is, where's the fear directed towards? What are we supposed to be scared of? Because the novel directs your fears somewhere, and we just have to figure out what that is. When we figure out what that is, we'll be able to infer what the Gothic novel is saying about this fear, whether or not it's criticizing it, what it's doing with the fear. So, okay, I'm back again. My mic died, so I had to bring in some reinforcements. So, I think the Gothic in general is mainly about fear. It takes our fears as a society and it exaggerates them to the point that we cannot look away. We are forced to confront our anxieties, our fears. We are forced to grapple with them, and we're forced to ask ourselves why we're scared of these things and whether or not we should maybe be scared of something else instead. So, some of the fears that would have been contemporary in the 18th century, some of the fears that the Gothic novels of the 18th century grapple with are things like the fear of the other, so like migrants, the fear of sexual liberty, that includes homosexuality, that includes female sexuality. There's also an emerging fear of female entrapment and patriarchal abuse and domestic entrapment that women face, so either entrapment as a wife or as a mother. All of these fears are represented in a lot of the 18th century Gothic novels. For example, in the Castle of Otranto, we already talked about domestic abuse, feminine men, like the fear of feminine men. Homosexuality is very entrenched in the Castle of Otranto. Where's that fear going? The fear is not really going towards Conrad or Isabella. The fear is going towards Manfred, who is the perpetrator. We're supposed to be scared of Manfred. I believe this would have been quite controversial, and it was quite controversial at the time. With the Romance of the Forest, are we supposed to be scared of Adeline, who is doing her own thing, who is trying to escape all of these entrapments that her society is imposing on her? No, we're supposed to be scared of the Marquis, who is a crazed uncle who is trying to have sex with his niece. I just wanted to add that the Romance of the Forest, what we are supposed to be scared of and what we are scared of, those two ideas are aligned. So we are supposed to be scared of the Marquis and the patriarchy he symbolizes, and for Adeline's autonomy to be taken away, and we are scared of those things. But with something like The Monk or Castle of Otranto, the things which we are supposed to be scared of versus what we actually are scared of may not be aligned depending on your interpretation. For example, with the Castle of Otranto, as I mentioned, are we supposed to be scared of feminine men, or are we supposed to be scared of the unruly children like Isabella running away from her father figure? Or we're supposed to be scared of Manfred's complete disregard for autonomy. In The Monk, are we supposed to be scared of women? And are we supposed to read the text as a sexist text? Is it warning us against the wiliness of women's ways? Or is it warning us against what happens to women when they live in a society which completely just does not think of them as human beings? The Monk. The Monk is a little bit less cut and dry, but in my opinion, the fear here is also directed towards the perpetrator. He's the main character of the story, but he's also the perpetrator. He is the least virtuous person in the entire novel, despite constantly talking about his virtue. So I believe here we're supposed to be scared of how women are treated by society. We're supposed to be scared of this patriarchal abuse. What could incest have to do with it? Like, why is incest used as a mode of teaching us what to fear? Really, what I believe it comes down to is sexuality, either sexual liberation or sexual repression, as well as homosexuality. These novels ask the questions of what it means to be a woman in a patriarchal society on the receiving end of male sexuality. As we've noticed, all of these characters that are constantly trying to escape these evil villains are female characters, and the perpetrators are always men trying to exert their will on the female heroines and completely disrespecting their consent and their will as a human being. I'm a human being with an independent will, which I now exert to leave you. Jane Eyre. I think I'm gonna make a video about Jane Eyre. There's too much not to talk about in Jane Eyre. This is where we see literature in the Gothic form begin to examine the way in which women are abused by the patriarchal structures in which they're placed. In each of these books, patriarchy plays a ginormous role. In the Castle of Otranto, there is a character called Matilda who is Manfred's daughter. She does not escape patriarchal abuse. She ends up murdered by her own father, Manfred. And also, she almost gets sold, or she almost gets arranged married to Manfred's like ally slash enemy, frenemy, in order to save the castle of Otranto. Obviously, Isabella is persecuted by Manfred the entire time. She is under his control. Like I said, she is an underprivileged person in that family, and Manfred realizes this and he abuses the power he has over Isabella. There's a character called Hippolyta, who is Manfred's wife, who is literal like Satan. Like, she's not in the book, but I just really hate her guts. She is the she's a very interesting character in the sense that she is a very realistic depiction of a domestic abuse survivor who is just trying to survive in her own household, and she is just like obsessed with her husband and tries to do the best she can in order to escape the abuse. But what that does to her children is that she becomes an abuser as well. In her ignorance of Manfred's abuse, she is abusive towards Matilda and Isabella. These conversations are not shied away from in the Castle of Otranto. In the Romance of the Forest, obviously we have Adeline. There's a very specific, very scary scene in the Romance of the Forest where one of the characters called Lamotte, with whom at this point in time Adeline is living with, so Lamotte and his wife, they kind of take her in and they all live in this decrepit abbey together to escape some of the persecution that Lamotte is facing for his debts. So at this point, the Marquis has made it known that he would like to have sex with Adeline. And there is a very terrifying scene in which Lamotte understands that what he's asking for is to rape Adeline. And he is about to let it happen. It's quite scary. I'm gonna see if I can find it. Essentially, what Lamotte thinks the Marquis is asking is to rape Adeline, and he's very okay with that. He's about to let it happen. But then, in the last minute, the Marquis reveals that he actually wants to kill Adeline. The motives behind his murderous intent are that Adeline is the real heir of the abbey, and the Marquis wants the abbey for himself. And here's the scene. Okay, this is Marquis. I have given you sufficient proof that I can be grateful. The services you have already rendered me with respect to Adeline have not been unrewarded. This is Lamont saying now. True, my lord, I am ever willing to acknowledge this, and am sorry it has not been in my power to serve you more effectually. Your farther views respecting her, I am ready to assist. Yikes. I thank you, Adeline. The Marquis hesitated. Adeline, rejoined Lamont, eager to anticipate his wishes, has beauty worth of your pursuit. She has inspired a passion of which she ought to be proud, and at any rate she shall soon be yours. Her charms are worthy of— Yes, yes, interrupted the Marquis, but— he paused. But they have given you too much trouble in the pursuit, said Lamont, and to be sure, my lord, it must be confessed they have. But this trouble is all over. You may now consider her as your own. I would do so, said the Marquis, fixed an eye of earnest regard upon Lamont. I would do so. Name your hour, my lord. You shall not be interrupted. Beauty such as Adeline's— Watch her closely, interrupted the Marquis, and on no account suffer her to leave her apartment. Where is she now? Confide in her chamber. Very well, but I am impatient. Name your time, my lord. Tomorrow night. Tomorrow night, said the Marquis. Tomorrow night. Do you understand me now? Yes, my lord. This night, if you wish it so. And then he says, Adeline dies, interrupted the Marquis. So we kind of, go off the rails there a little bit, but creepy as hell, right? I mean, come on, guys. The undertone of this insidious conversation is that Adeline is about to get raped and Lamont is about to let it happen. Her caretaker, somebody that is supposed to look after her because she's friendless, she's an orphan, she doesn't have any money of her own, she's a woman, she's vulnerable. This person is supposed to take care of her, and instead, he doesn't. He victimizes her. So, or he's about to victimize her, rather. Coffee. Okay, the monk. The monk is a very obvious depiction of this patriarchal abuse as well. Ambrosio uses the power that he has, over the influence that he has over the entire city of Madrid to get close to Antonia, to get close to her mother, or their mother. Remember, they're siblings. To murder their mother, so he commits matricide on top of everything else, and to rape Antonia. And the reason he is allowed to do this is because he is a man with power, which he does not know how to use for good. He uses it for evil. So what we see here with all of this incest is this sort of dynamic, right, that exists. It exists to this day, but it has existed for centuries up until the 18th century. This abusive patriarchal dynamic that women are victimized by is exaggerated to the proportions of such a disgusting, depraved, taboo topic as incest. A husband raping his wife would not have been considered as taboo in the 18th century as it is today. A brother raping his sister has always been taboo in the 18th century as well. This incest represents the female lived experience that has been taking place for centuries at this point, and exaggerated to the point where we cannot look away from it. We're forced to deal with this horrible thing in front of us. The tragedy and the victimhood of living in the society that fundamentally believes that you are not equal to a man in your personhood. This is partially why in the 18th century, these Gothic novels always took place in a far away foreign land, and also in like a past century. Like these all usually take place in the somewhat like 1500s or so. I think the Romance of the Forest takes place. I'll look that up, but I think it was like 1500s. Because if it was today, meaning the 18th century, if it was today and if it was in England, it would have been too close to home. But this is kind of the point, that it is close to home. It's happening in England, it's happening in the 18th century. We are just showing it through the lens of a 1500s, like Italy or something. It's happening in France, in the Romance of the Forest. It's happening in Madrid, like with the monk. It's happening in Italy, like with the Castle of Otranto. And it's happening, in the 1500s, 1600s. It's not happening now. It's not happening in England, but it is. So all of these feelings, we're basically forced to look at it and go, holy shit, this is horrific. And an 18th century audience would have understood that. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe this is why it was so misunderstood. This brings me to the theory of the female Gothic. So, the female Gothic is a theory, like a literary lens, through which a lot of these novels are read. The idea of reading these books through the lens of the female suffering and what it means to be a woman in this kind of society, to have basically no autonomy and no choice. Ruth Perry puts it really beautifully, I think. I'm just going to read you an excerpt from her article. The attached abbeys, chapels, and monasteries with their nuns and monks signify celibacy, austerity, and repressed sexuality, but they are redolent always in these fictions of broken vows, limited, transgressed, and orgiastic pleasures. Heavy doors that only lock from the outside, small, hard-to-find openings in basement vaults and grates, massy keys, dark, narrow, and uncomfortable passages and staircases. All of these features have expressive meaning when associated with the scenario of a girl singled out, against her will, in her own domestic space, for the sexual attentions of a father, an uncle, or a brother. Indeed, one could argue that these Gothic structures, with their labyrinthine internal passages, stand for the body of the heroine, a body under siege, in which she is hopelessly and desperately trapped. This goes back to what I mentioned in the beginning with the tropes, and how these abbeys usually represent some sort of patriarchal abuse. This is the first time I've seen it also be linked to the heroine's body. I just think it's very interesting. We're obviously not asked to fear our brothers and uncles and fathers. We are asked to fear female entrapment and patriarchal abuse. We, or the 18th century audience, are asked to fear that at any moment as a woman, your autonomy can be taken away by your family members, by men in general. The Gothic takes this idea of female entrapment and patriarchal abuse and inflates it to the gory incest, the grotesqueness that we cannot look away from. Another reading of why there's so much incest is the reading of repressed homosexuality. Two of the books I discussed, The Monk and the Castle of Otranto, are both written by gay men. There is a link between the incest and the way these gay men would have perceived themselves within the societal context. So, the unnatural, grotesque individual. Jill Campbell is a scholar whose article I really liked. It's called I Am No Giant, and it talks about the incest in the Castle of Otranto. And it has this very interesting link between the homosexuality of Horace Walpole and the incest in the Castle of Otranto, and the largeness of the bodies. So the giant knight, for example, she makes the comparison between the giant knight who destroys the castle at the end and whose helmet crushes Conrad to death in the beginning of the novel, and the smallness with which Horace Walpole constantly describes himself in his letters to his friends, which we may assume were also homosexual men. She views this disparity as something Walpole would have been doing to compare himself with this exaggerated heterosexual abnormality of incest. Basically, viewing himself and his circle as ordinary people. This, I believe, is an act of defiance on Walpole's side to fight against the injustice of being perceived as less than for your sexuality or for your femininity as a man, and basically viewing this aggressively heterosexual society as this giant sick force of impending doom. And he shows that depravity through incest. In The Monk, we have the character of Matilda, who initially appears as this kind of male figure. Matilda technically is genderless, which is another very interesting thing. I mean, for an 18th century novel, we really have a lot of like genderqueer theory to unpack, but in terms of Matilda herself, she doesn't have a gender. She is actually a demon. So when we see her originally, she appears to Ambrosio as a man, as one of the like monks in the abbey. It's quite unclear whether or not Ambrosio falls in love with him, or if that only like takes place after it is revealed that Matilda is a woman. But either way, it is a very interesting choice to have a character that is supposed to be the like seductive character start out as a man in the novel. Another very interesting scene in the novel is that after it is revealed that Matilda is a woman, or in our perception as a woman, and Matilda is saying she's gonna go away and everything from the abbey so as to not torture Ambrosio with her womanness anymore. Ambrosio goes to pick her a flower, and then he ends up bit by a snake in the flower bush. This is a pretty clear feminization of the character of Ambrosio, because he is shown here as the figure of Eve. He is bitten by the snake. He is seduced into this sin. He is not the character of Adam. He is very much the Eve character. I think the Gothic is such a fascinating genre because I haven't really come across another genre that is quite so comfortable taking our anxieties and just shoving them in our faces and forcing us to look at them. My professor during one of the classes said that Saltburn is an example of a Gothic work, and that made me really fascinated with Saltburn. I watched the movie twice. The first time I really loved it. The second time I didn't. And I think I didn't love it the second time because I watched a bunch of video essays on YouTube about how horrible the movie actually is. I am now of a third opinion that I'm not sure what to make of it. And I think that's what the Gothic is about at the end of the day. We're really just not sure what to do with it. And that's what makes it so special. Whenever you are engaging in a work that can be considered a Gothic, this is the most important question to ask yourself. Where is the fear directed to? What am I supposed to be afraid of? Am I supposed to be afraid of the thing that they're using? Or am I supposed to be afraid of the bigger picture? For example, in Saltburn, I'm not sure if we're supposed to be scared of this guy. I forgot his name. The guy that's played by Sabrina's ex-boyfriend. I don't remember his name either. Or are we supposed to be afraid of this upper class English society that would rather shove their son's death like away, as far away from them as possible, and be like continue trying to be disingenuous and like everything's fine, not talk about anything? Like, I don't know. I don't know. This is not about Saltburn. And there's also no incest in Saltburn. No, yeah, there's no incest in Saltburn. So here, we're not supposed to be scared of our male relatives, obviously. We are supposed to be scared of the power structures that are at play, the patriarchy, the social prejudices against women and against homosexual men. Or rather, the 18th century audience is supposed to be afraid of that, but we should be afraid of that too. There's probably something else that I'm missing because I have this feeling every time I delve deep into the Gothic, I feel like I'm missing something. I feel there's another interpretation just under the, like, just if I read one more thing or if I like talk about it a little bit more, there's something else to uncover. But for now, I think I've managed to at least begin to unpack why incest is used to such a regard in the 18th century Gothic novel.